Hello and welcome to today's GGKP webinar, Rebuilding Better, What Sand Got to Do with It. I'm John Mon, the Research Program Manager here at GGKP. Thank you so much for being with us today. If you're not familiar with the GGKP, we're a global partnership of experts and organizations dedicated to providing knowledge, guidance, data, and tools to transition to an inclusive green economy to communities across the green growth space, policy, business, and finance communities. We encourage you to learn a bit more, and you can find our web platforms online and join the growing community. Today's webinar has been organized in collaboration with the United Nations Environment Programme's GRID network. GRID works to transform geospatial data into policy-relevant information and knowledge to support environmental decision-making. We're very fortunate to be joined by a number of experts from the World Bank's Office of Environmental Standards, from Jamaica's National Environment and Planning Agency, from Royal HaskoningDHV, a multinational engineering firm, and E4U, an Inspired by Nature digital business platform. We encourage all of you to submit questions and comments throughout the webinar. It's a great way to engage directly with this panel of experts. And after the webinar, if you do have a minute or two, we'd very much appreciate it if you filled in the survey. That will help us shape better future webinars. And finally, if you have missed a bit of today's webinar, we will make available the presentations as well as a recording of the full session afterwards on our website at ggkp.org/sand governance. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you today's moderator, Pascal Peduzzi, Director of UN Environment Program's GRID-Geneva and part-time professor at the University of Geneva. He's a specialist in remote sensing and geographic information systems, GIS. And he's also coordinating the implementation of the World Environment Situation Room, which is a data platform for monitoring the state of the Earth and the state of the environment. Pascal, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, John, and welcome everybody. So when we talk about sand, people usually imagine this kind of sandy beach, and that's what they think it's sand. But in fact, our relationship to sand is more like these kind of things like building material that we're using. We're mixing with cement, we're mixing with rocks and water, and we get concrete. And this is really what we are driving as an impact for sand. So because what we do with sand, we're building roads. We are building a huge amount of buildings, infrastructure, bridges, tunnels, houses, and so on. We use sand for concrete for building dams, for hydropower, for irrigation purpose. We use it for making glasses and windows. We even use that for land reclamation. So this is Dubai in 2001, and you see the same place in 2011, where these palm trees shaped of artificial islands were built. So we can see that from space. Same happened with Singapore, that increased its territory by 13% or even more, by 23%, sorry, since 1970s, taking sand from Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, even further away. So, and even we're using sand for computers. So sand is really everywhere. Our society are actually built on sand. So this is very important material. The problem is that sand is actually produced by very slow erosion processes like glaciers, rivers, waves, or wind erosion that are shrinking big rocks into gravels and then sand. And that takes thousands of years to do that. Now, the way we're using sand is very fast, and we've got big material for doing that, large tools for extracting, shifting, transporting sand, and for our building purpose as other purposes that we saw before. So you cannot extract that amount of material, and we're talking here about 50 billion tons of sand per year. That's enough to build a wall of 27 meters wide by 27 meters high all around planet Earth every year. And it's impossible to extract such a huge amount of material without causing impact on the environment. And in other words, it's actually 18 kilogram per day per people on planet Earth. So we have, depending of where you're taking sand, it can be from quarries, you have impact on the land, on deforestation. You can have people removing sand, like here in Tunisia, from coastal area, and that is weakening the resistance against sea level rise, for storm surge, but also for salinations of coastal aquifers. People are removing sand from rivers. This is happening in many, many different places, especially in Southeast Asia. It's changing the course of those rivers, the river flows. It might lead to further floods or further drought, river banks erosion as well, affecting the fauna as well as the ecology of that river. And you have people removing sand from the beach. It's poor people, they're looking for livelihood, the sand is there, they need sand for building purpose, but if it's not framed accordingly, then you look at this beach. I mean, after half a day of operation, this beach is lost, and then they go to the next beach, and of course, this is again weakening people's resistance against sea level rise, salinification of aquifer, destroying the ecosystem of the beach, and preventing any touristic development in this beach. Now you have those kind of boats that looks like a giant vacuum cleaner. They are removing sand from the bottom of the sea. It's for marine sand extraction. And that has also impact because it's basically crunching all the microorganisms that you see at the bottom of the sea, and it's creating a change in turbidity, impacting the biodiversity, but also impacting the fisheries. And when you extract sand further away from the coastline, you're creating a gap. And because sand can behave as a liquid, it will, through the years, move from this beach, for example, here, towards this gap that you've been creating. And this flow of sand is causing a coastal erosion. And that we've seen in many places around the world. Already beach erosion is appearing for different reasons, like sea level rise and destruction of the local ecosystem. So sand is also an issue. But why we use the sand from deserts? It appears that the desert sand is too round, too fine, and anyway, it's too far away from where we need it. I mean, desert by definition are not really places that are inhabited, and if you need to transport sand from these desert places to where it's needed, it will be really too expensive. But on top of not being the appropriate size of grain, you need something very hedgy so that it takes together, it mixes together for making concrete or for land reclamation purposes. So in 2014, we bring this awareness on the sand issue and the impact on the environment. In 2019, we bring another report called Sand and Sustainability, Finding New Solutions for Environmental Governance of Global Sand Resources. And that report was picked up at the United Nations Environment Assembly, the fourth session in March 2019, and led to the resolution on mineral resource governance. So we see that countries took interest that sand was not properly extracted, there was no sustainable use of sand, and that was bringing to this new resolution that was taken by the governments, asking for having more information regarding the extraction of sand in a more sustainable way, about solutions for reducing sand and so on. And that's what we've been trying to do now. We built a global sand observatory at GRID-Geneva to promote awareness about these problems of sand, for monitoring and explore sand resource governance. We know that the construction sector is the largest use of sectors, and is very important about this post-COVID recovery, because we need investment strategy for reigniting the economy, and that will put more pressure on this valuable resource of sand. So we know that the demand is growing, and to address sand and sustainability issue, we need really to discuss with all stakeholders and see how we can reduce the impact and reduce the amount of sand that we're using. So today's webinar is about having a conversation, what we need on the topic of sand extraction in the context of the COVID recovery planning. And we have this intertwined crisis between social justice, biodiversity loss, and climate change, on top of having these health and economic crisis of COVID. So this is what we have bring this webinar together. We've got 4 brilliant panelists that I will introduce shortly. But for now, let me leave the floor to Laura Platchkov for her intervention. Laura is a a policy advisor at the International Affairs Division from the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment. Laura, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Pascal, for giving me the floor. I'm very pleased to provide a few opening remarks on the importance of sand and the broader political context. As Pascal's presentation has shown, many people do not realize the importance of sand in our daily lives and its many uses. As he said, each of us indirectly consume about 18 kilos of sand every day, so that today it's the largest volume of solid material extracted globally with major environmental impacts, yet it is the least regulated in some regions. And when we look at the global figures, we see that there have been a major increase in the extraction of sand and gravel over the last 50 years, almost by a factor 5. And we expect this demand to further grow in the coming years. One of the drivers for sand is infrastructure, and UNEP estimates that about 75% of the infrastructure needed by 2050 is yet to be built. So this gives a bit of a sense of the challenges ahead of us. And the COVID recovery context further exacerbates these trends because of the financial packages that are being injected to restart the economy. Literally, that's trillions of dollars. And these investments are often directed towards the infrastructure sector, which is a primary candidate for quick recovery and job creation. So this further drives this increase in demand. So from an environmental point of view, we face risks, but we also have an unprecedented opportunity to rebuild better if these investments are directed towards low carbon, resource efficient, and sustainable economies. And as was mentioned by Pascal, at the global level, there is now really a political momentum regarding this issue. During the last United Nations Environment Assembly, the fourth UNEA, that's the world's highest political authority for the environment, 2 of the resolutions that were adopted by the international community called for more sustainable management of sand. The first resolution addresses sand in terms of its extraction. It's a resolution on mineral resource governance that was proposed by Mexico and co-sponsored by Switzerland. The second resolution, which was proposed by Mongolia and actively supported by Switzerland as well, focuses on sustainable infrastructure and therefore addresses sand in terms of its use. And those resolutions are really good news because it shows that the international community is now starting to discuss these issues to try to find ways to foster global cooperation on these issues. And member states will have a follow-up discussion at the next UNEA, which will take place in February 2021, and could then decide on any further action step to strengthen the sustainable management of sand resources. So Switzerland supported various work streams by UNEP on these topics, and in particular, we were pleased to see how the work by UNEP GRID on sand has been influential to raise this worldwide awareness from the first report in 2014 to their 2019 report that was referenced in the resolution. So we are really looking forward to the continuation of this work, and in particular today to today's webinar and discussion. Thank you very much.
We have with us, we have 4 panelists today, and very fortunate. And let me welcome them on board. So first we have Charles de Leva, who's Chief Officer on Environmental and Social Standards at the World Bank. Charles has worked on bank projects in all regions, focusing on environmental and social issues in complex and high-risk settings. We also have Pratap Hegde, founder and CEO of Rain T4U in India. Pratap is a serial entrepreneur creating collaborative platforms enabled by digital technologies that herald the shift in sand extraction, monitoring, and governance in India. We also have Lisette Heuer, from Global Director of Resilience and Global Water Strategy, Director of Royal HaskoningDHV in the Netherlands. Lisette leads on business strategy and focus on water and nature for this independent international engineering and project management consultancy firm. And finally, we have with us also Anthony McKenzie, He's Director of the Environmental Management and Conservation, National Environment and Planning Agency in Jamaica. Anthony is an expert in coastal zone planning and management for climate resilience and had a leading role in the National Beach Monitoring Program. So welcome all of you, and we look forward for an interesting discussion. So just to start this discussion, we are facing many challenges, climate change, biodiversity, achieving the sustainable development goals, and now we have this COVID and health and economic crisis. So will government be tempted to boost the infrastructure, to reignite the economy? What are going to be those future challenges that we are facing now with sand, and why should we be talking about sand right now? So let me hand over first to Charles de Leva. Please, Charles, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pascal. I think you've laid out in everyone and very clear that there's going to be massive investment to try to deal with what was already an infrastructure gap before COVID struck. And now with COVID, that demand continues, but it's at an accelerated pace because it's coupled with large-scale unemployment. So as a result, the concerns that we have about environmental and social impact with extraction is at an acute point due to the speed with which governments are feeling pressured to move forward.
We're losing you, Charles. I can't hear you, Charles, anymore.
Charles?
It's hydro facilities. Yes, sorry. You can hear me okay, I presume, right?
I can.
Yeah, okay, good. It's hydro facilities that will wind up leading to more sedimentation of these very sands that you might otherwise need for construction. It's quarries that will be set up in many areas to provide the aggregate for these roads. And unless we're doing it with proper preparation, proper due diligence, you're going to find the continued kind of erosion and soil loss and the loss of opportunity to find alternatives. So in a way, we go back to some very basic aspects of development, is good environmental and social planning, not only at the local level, but because these kinds of extractions also have transboundary impacts, it requires governments often to work together at the transboundary level to deal with this. So I think fortunately, from Development Bank's standpoint, the concept of building back better is well integrated in what we've been saying. We've been saying that as we hopefully can generate the additional resources needed to deal with the scale of COVID impacts, we will be committed to doing it in a way that's resilient, where we take climate impacts into consideration, where we look at the social impacts, and hopefully what we don't find is that some governments have decided today to actually reduce the attention to EIA or because of concerns about lack of investment, lack of employment. We're going back to some of the risks that we will try to accelerate development that will just exacerbate the kinds of concerns that I think you outlined, Pascal.
Thank you very much, Charles. Pratap, you've been changing the landscape of governance over the sand tracking with your company. So tell us, why should we talk about sand right now from an Indian perspective?
Thank you, Pascal. And the whole rushing back concept now, the phenomenon is to get back to the old normal very quickly and rush towards GDP-centric economic models, urban-centric development. This is a huge risk which we are currently confronting with. Every government is under tremendous pressure to restart the construction activity, but most of these, the so-called development activities would be urban-centric. And this is what the challenge which we are going to face now. This would certainly mount huge pressure on the entire natural resources and particularly sand. And, this is a great opportunity for all of us, for the government, for everyone to look into alternative economic models. Is it a great opportunity we have in our lifetime to create some kind of, sustainable, inclusive, healthy, well-being oriented economy? We can't just do certain symptomatic changes. We need to look into the fundamentals and rebuild perhaps the lives and the economy in a different way. It's a great opportunity to see this, a great opportunity to study this. And sand is one such thing, which gives us a lot of lessons. And instead of continuing to overexploit sand, if you understand sand a little bit more comprehensively and bring in the governance models, today we have the technology with us. We are empowered with considerable amount of expertise today, and the technologies required for creating a kind of multi-stakeholder models, if we can create, and which can be a very much participative without compromising on the livelihood. These are the experiments which we have done very, very successfully in countries like India, wherein all the stakeholders we could bring on a common platform, common digital platform. So in the process, the entire activity in the sand sector can be made very transparent and responsible. And this is the time to perhaps move in that direction much more strongly. And I am very, very happy that such an initiative is being taken here, and it would be, it's a very, very timely, particularly in the context of the recovery from the COVID-beaten economy.
Thank you very much, Pratap. Lisette, we've got all these coastal under threat. We have with sea level rise. We have all this infrastructure. How do you see this use of sand? How we can frame that? What's your view on this sand? Or we talk about sand now?
Yeah,
well, like several people mentioned before, we need to talk about sand right now, because I see that in response to the major economic impact of COVID, many governments and IFI funding increased their investments to counterbalance the current economic shrinkage due to COVID. So the trigger might be the wish for creating jobs and acceleration of economic recovery, but many people, including myself, see also a huge and potential game-changing opportunity to use these investments for pushing climate action, enhancing resilience, and rebuilding better in our response to the current crisis. Like Charles just mentioned, the World Bank, for example, is front-loading their investment plan, focusing on relief, restructuring, and resilient recovery. Many governments invest in measures directly impacting our living environment with large infrastructure developments, and this is where sand as key building material comes in. This investment impulse to infrastructure development will further increase sand demands, while sand resource governance is a major sustainability challenge and requires careful consideration in light of our rebuilding better ambitions. In my view, this rebuilding better and enhancing resilience need to include 4 principles. We need to take an integrated system approach, it was mentioned before as well, fitting local context, and by doing it right, making global impact. We need social inclusiveness and empowering people by local engagement and community involvement. We need transparent governance with strong policies, regulations, and governmental institutes. And we need public-private partnerships. Everyone has a role to play, and rebuilding better and enhancing resilience should be a combined effort of businesses and government, not just one or the other, and it needs to be beneficial for both. Effort and gain to go hand in hand. So at first sight, increasing sand demand might look beneficial for sand-related businesses such as dredgers. However, for sustainable business operations, they also need a continuous, steady and predictable flow of work. They use very specific, expensive equipment, traveling across the globe from operation to operation, and procurement is quite expensive for them, as well as being out of production. So operational planning and logistics are of great importance. So front-loading of the investments in infrastructure development will generate an injection and increase demand now, but will also result in a dip in investments and decrease in demand later. So for longer-term business, enhanced job security, a balanced approach is important. No one benefits if all works come to market at the same time, with not enough market capacity to deliver, nor by all businesses being up and running whilst the market demand drops again. We need to have a balanced approach to maximize opportunities for sustainable delivery. So the key question to me is how best to combine the push for accelerated infrastructure development, resulting in increased sand demands, with the opportunity to push for sustainable and resilient cities and communities in a way that serves both public and private sector. So that's why we need to talk about sand.
Thank you very much, indeed. Anthony, I started working on a project 10 years ago in Jamaica on coastal erosion, and that's actually where it started my passion about sand. So I owe Jamaica that role and on that subject. So I'm very pleased to have you on board. So please give us this island perspective. I know that Jamaica was recently hosting a meeting of heads of states on financing for development in the era of COVID-19 and beyond. So Jamaica has a central role here, a leading role. So please give us your perspective from Jamaica. And unmute yourself, please. Yes.
Right. Thank you very much, Pascal, and good morning again, everybody. Right. So the discussion about sand for us is critical. I mean, it has to be a central part of our discussion. And if we consider island nation as Jamaica, we depend a lot on our tourism industry. In fact, it's about 25% or thereabout of our gross domestic product. So it's a significant part of our economy. And the basis of that industry is our coastal environment, or sand or beach resource. And therefore it has to be paramount in our conversation about our economic development, specifically as well in the context of our building back better after COVID-19. It has been demonstrated, and we've seen that with the shutdown that we've experienced back in March, April, we have seen where, because of the shutdown, there was respite on our resources. So we've seen some improvements. We've seen, for example, in areas where we've never seen turtle nesting on sand on our beaches, we've seen turtles come back to those locations. We've seen improvements in water quality. And so there are lessons to be learned from this COVID experience and how we manage economic development in a systematic way. Now, I think I want to make the point that in our conversation that our beaches and the sand resources of our beaches need to be seen in the context of the wider coastal ecosystem, or reefs, or natural vegetation on the beaches, and of course our coastal wetlands. And as we consider, and I mean, you mentioned the deliberations earlier in the conversation about financing for economic development, we have to, as a country, and I'm speaking in the context of Jamaica, place a lot of emphasis on how we manage our resources, how we protect our resources, and how that protection can contribute in adding value to the nation. The issue as we face as a small island nation in the Caribbean, and perhaps I could speak for other small island nations as well, and I'll be quick. There's the issue of coastal erosion. And not since 2005 have we seen so many tropical storms and hurricanes coming through the area. We just had one last week, contributing to significant erosion. And Pascal, you'll be familiar with Negril. They got a beating from that. So the beaches are under threat because of climate change, hurricanes. And so sand has to be a part of that central discussion. We're talking about economic development moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. This is really key. I mean, especially, well, Jamaica is not a small island, and we have much smaller islands than Jamaica that will face coastal erosion and so on. So we are really need to target this this issue of sand and try to see how we can bring that challenge and ensure that we have sustainable sand resources, while at the same time we have population growth, migration from urban, rural to urban, and we need to achieve zero net CO2 emissions. All these challenges are mixing each other. So for the participants, you can go in the chat box, and if you've seen any challenges, how sand extraction and use is regulated in your countries, you know, you might give your testimony on this one, or if you've seen any exciting opportunities on emerging for better practices. But that's what we want to discuss now, is those challenges versus opportunities, and come back with you, Anthony. So what do you see as challenges and opportunities around this post-COVID recovery?
Thank you again, Pascal. We have some challenges. I mean, some traditional challenges actually. The question of equitable access to the resource, the sand and the beach as a resource. I don't want to capture it in that way. Traditionally, we've had this ribbon type of tourism development along our coast, right? And whether real or perceived, there is that question of access to the resource, the sand resource. There's a challenge from local communities that there is not that access to go onto the beach to allow for recreation, to recreate, and that to a large extent, some of the larger properties are taking over that coastal environment and having access to the use of the sand at the beach as a resource. I think another challenge that we face is the whole question of the lack of data. As I mentioned earlier, the question of erosion and how we respond to the erosion. There's a need to source sediment and sand to re-nourish the beaches, for example. In a lot of instances, we have seen where the sand has been deposited in the shelf, away from being able to be naturally replenished onto the beach. And there are locations. We had preliminary studies that looked at that on the southern banks of Jamaica, we probably have over 200 million cubic meters of sand. I'm talking about calcareous and silicate type sand, suitable for some of the beaches. But we need to, and it's a challenge, we need to have the data that would support or responding to those issues in a specific way. There's also the question of and the challenge associated with enforcement. In the past, we've had illegal removal of sand, both along our coast and in our river basins. That still persists, while we've had a regulatory regime for licensing of the removal of sediments and sand from our river basins. We still do have that challenge, and that has to be, we have to come to grips with that in a more robust regulatory framework. And as I indicated, our Prime Minister is, in talking about responding to the COVID situation, is aggressive about development and the infrastructural development. And there will be the challenge I mean, we're going into building new highways and new roads that require sediment and aggregates and sand, and that will have some implications for how we manage the resources in a sustainable way without having that significant negative impact on the environment. I'll stop there for the moment.
Thank you, Anthony. Charles, you're managing, you're part of this big organization doing development, lots of infrastructure. What do you see as challenge for technical policy and sustainable management of this sand resource in this post-COVID?
Well, I think we're definitely trying to indicate the attraction of moving away from gray infrastructure to green infrastructure. I think, unfortunately, we have centuries of a tradition of doing large-scale infrastructure, which often is attractive because of the scale of the money that's transferred. And I think there's a sense that if we, instead of building a concrete jetty, we put in mangroves. Well, is that really going to boost the economy? So we have to get away from that traditional sense that it's not building big necessarily, but building green. In the long run, you have a better long-term economic, environmental, and social value. It's more sustainable in the long run. So that's one big aspect of it. The other that's a challenge is that sand is not seen like a commodity that's easily regulated. So for example, supply chain issues where we've made great progress in the world, I think, on dealing with timber. We have Forest Stewardship Council certification, we have lots of biodiversity tools, for example, that IUCN has created. You have IBAT for biodiversity. We don't have that for sand. So there's the technological aspect of knowing where these deposits are and their value. And I think a lot of the environmental and social problems has been through chronic extraction, where it's low scale. So it's not the kind of big scale where you will bring the focus of environmental impact assessment and civil society. There's a chronic extraction activities that have taken place over the years. And so as a result, it hasn't lent itself to the kind of legal regulatory framework that then civil society and World Bank and UN partners can look to and say, okay, this is how we regulate this kind of extraction. So we have a number of challenges that I think we have to focus on. And then going just back again to COVID, the fact that in this COVID era, it's very hard to monitor what's going on in the field, because very often agencies, enforcement officers really are not able to travel the way they were before. So we've got a number of challenges, but at least we've identified, I think, where they are, and so we can make progress with those. Thanks.
Thank you very much. But we also have opportunities. Lisette, what do you see as the related sand resources in post-COVID recovery? Is there a new trend, new political will, new technologies that we could use for as an opportunity?
So for rebuilding better for climate action, for example, against floods, droughts, and natural disasters, you can use a mix of measures. So it's on one hand physical measures, and they can be grey infrastructure, but also green infrastructure or adaptive building. But it can also be operational measures like water management, emergency response, and disaster management. Or more on the strategies, policies, and spatial solutions side, like master planning and zoning. And last but certainly not least, also information and communication based. So risk and impact mapping, monitoring, forecasting, and warning systems. So to the last two options, I would like to dive a little bit deeper. So for example, in case of an upcoming disaster, automated alerting and warning messages using smartphones can be very effective in reducing impact on people on the streets. Organizational and planning measures are often less costly and less vulnerable than hard infrastructure protection. The effect and lifespan of structural measures shortens over time due to exponential climate change. Applying alternative climate action measures instead of building grey infrastructure protection reduce the need for sand and as such prevent environmental and social impact of sand extraction. Another alternative to sand-intense grey infrastructure, for enhancing flood and erosion resilience of islands and sandy coastlines is using nature-based solutions such as sandscaping. So with sandscaping, the sand used as building material remains in its natural environment. Sandscaping involves nourishing the shore with a large quantity of sand, which is then spread around by the natural processes like tides, waves, to protect the coast from erosion and flooding in the event of major storm surges. The advantage is the sand remains part of the natural system, but also it aims to have only one larger intervention impacting the natural system and then have a lifetime of about 20 years instead of annual smaller beach nourishment, which has interventions each year. So every time there is an impact. For this nature-based solution, sandscaping solution, we applied several projects around the world. One of them is in Beckton in the UK, and it's really a great example of public-private partnership. So preventing of coastal erosion for the upcoming years, hence enabling communities to continue their lives in their current villages, otherwise their villages might basically fall down from the cliffs, so then they had to move the village. But it was also protection of a high valuable energy asset to remain in production, and last but not least, give an economic impulse to the area with an attractive beach for tourism and recreation, which was mentioned for Jamaica as well to be very important. So the whole area benefits from it. So these are ways to combine the push for accelerated infrastructure development with the opportunity to push for sustainable and resilient cities, infrastructure and communities in a way that serves both public and private sector and prevent the increase of sand demand and the negative side effects of sand extraction.
We see a lot of ways of building with nature, and that would certainly remove stress on these natural resources. Pratap, you've been the first talking about opportunity about this. You are in the business, you're creating business with technology, so definitely you see opportunities. What can you tell us about this?
As I see it, it's a great opportunity in a couple of ways. At one level, in developing countries, we have seen a great new phenomenon of the labor movement towards rural areas. The city-based people are moving away from the cities. And even me, earlier I was sitting and working in city of Bangalore. Now I am working in a village around 30-40 kilometers away from Bangalore. Now, this is the very, very positive development in my opinion. So what is going to happen? And it is that the demand for real estate and the construction in the city is going to go down. And if everybody looks into this very holistically, it's a great opportunity to much more distributed economy. And there are, again, not only the labor force which is moving back to hinterland, it is also the working class is also moving back to their villages. So this is also creating a kind of, the talent in the rural areas so that they can understand these issues, the environmental issues and the sand consumption issues better. What we are trying to do is bringing everybody together, from the consumers to the sand miners to the government or the administration. Everybody, if you can bring on one common digital platform, as the slide talks about. I think Mr. Charles was talking about the supply chain. The entire supply chain can be digitalized and monitored in the real time. As I was telling earlier, technologies are available. And with this kind of community-centric approach, now, we can create such kind of technology-enabled platforms wherein all the stakeholders around the site, from the administration to the mining community to the consumers, if they all join hands and be responsible for the entire the mining, storage, transportation and the consumption of the sand, I think we have a solution. At one level we make it transparent, at the other level we make it accountable. In India I have seen this. The sand used to be measured in the number of truckloads. Today, thanks to the integration of the weigh bridges at every level, we are able to exactly measure how many kgs of the sand is being actually mined and stored and transported. The one good thing about the sand is nobody can eat sand. It is to be transported from the point of mining to the point of consumption. When you monitor the transportation, you are in control of most of it. And today, as all of you know, there are enough technologies to do it. And digitalization is the solution. By bringing that in and creating very inclusive communities around this, it is possible to create much better accountability for the whole problem which we are facing. And with a good amount of awareness in the rural areas particularly, and the consumption going away from the city to the rural areas, I think we can solidly move towards solution. I think such kind of involvement of multilateral agencies will go a long way in creating such sustainable models, rather than just stopping the sand consumption. If we can move to conscious consumption, if you move to responsible consumption of the sand, I think we have done a great service to the lives of everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Pratap. And it's quite fascinating how you've been changing the landscape of the sand shifting and being able to track sand and combating illegal sand mining using technology. This is really a hope for many countries on how to target this. We're going now to the open discussion, and I want to encourage our participants to raise questions to our panelists. And I see already some of them, so let's try to have this open dialogue, and please submit your questions. So we have a question regarding how to encourage sustainable construction and processes. Nature-based solution with tender are decided on cost and lowest bidder, when tenders and projects often do not have room for innovation, or project owners do not demand sustainable solution. This is true. This is something we've been facing quite often, that gray engineering is the mainstream. Is that what people know? It's been well engineered. It's well known by all the people who know how to implement. But how do we push for green engineering instead, or a combination of both? So maybe a question for Lisette and Charles on this one.
So to start with some examples. So there are many good examples where we combine grey and green infrastructure in practice. So for example, I just mentioned the Beckton sand engine in the UK, but we also worked on a sand engine in the Netherlands. We worked on wetland restoration in Tacloban in the Philippines, and also in development of natural lines of protection in reinforcement of the Houtdijk in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, we also combined room for the river with traditional embankments, which have been in place for centuries. So the dikes combined with more room for water. Also related to the question, I do see an increase of tender opportunities which explicitly ask for nature-based solutions. For example, we are working on a Madagascar coastal resilience, which is also World Bank funded, and there nature-based solutions definitely is at the heart of the project.
Thank you, Lisa. Charles, on green engineering, how does World Bank does that between green and grey engineering?
Yeah, I think Lisette just gave a great example where our new sustainable procurement policy leads us in the direction of rewarding environmentally and socially sustainable procurement proposals, so that bidders are encouraged to do that. They get more points by doing it. And in addition, what we've also done is change our environmental and social policies to make it very explicit that the results of the environmental and social due diligence must be incorporated in the contractor's plans, and that the contractor and the borrower are legally obligated to be sure that they are cascaded down to the subcontractors. Because as the UNEP report points out, I think the large-scale actors in the construction field are becoming more and more responsible over time. But it's often at the subcontractor level where that awareness is not always paramount. So what we're trying to do is make it very clear to our borrowers that this is something that's a responsibility throughout the contractual chain. And I think that's having some success, as well as the fact that we are working with local community groups to empower them and make them realize, and I think Pratap mentioned this as well, that make them realize that they can be the eyes and ears of the project, and that they have grievance mechanisms at the local level and at our corporate headquarters to report if they think that any of these construction practices are not being carried out properly. And we have had a multifold increase in civil society letting us know if they think that something's going wrong, and then we can take action. We had a project, a roads project, where a quarry operator was working so quickly that they started to undermine the transmission towers that were nearby the quarry. We suspended that activity. So these are things where I think we are improving our ability on dealing with accountability and enforcement.
Thank you, Charles.
Pascal, perhaps I could chime in here a little, because just as another example, I think, well, the World Bank has assisted Jamaica through a disaster vulnerability risk project. We have prepared national policy guidelines that support and encourages hybrid engineering responses in terms of coastal protection and enhancement. And so those policy guidelines have been mainstreamed into our coastal planning and management regime. The bank has also supported us in looking at our coastal wetlands and doing an economic assessment, looking at that contribution to the protection of our coast. And as I indicated earlier, we look at it as a total ecosystem. So we're encouraging, from a policy and planning point of view, hybrid nature-based solutions. And we have some good, we have some examples that we're learning from here in Jamaica that over the next couple months and years we can build on.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Is a question for Pratap. Is there any evidence that construction is moving more toward rurals? I mean, what you just said, even then, how will it reduce the use of sand? And do you see a scope for recycling of constructions and ways to reduce need for sand?
This question to me?
Yes, please. You talk about people with a post-COVID, that people staying more in their village and returning to their village, so that we reduce the need for new construction in the urban area. Do you have evidence of that, and how it will reduce the use of sand? We see also the scope for recycling of construction waste.
Yeah, the first question, I am able to see that. In my opinion, the cities are going to shrink now post-COVID. Cities are no more healthy. They have never been healthy. They have been a part of the so-called conventional modern economy, and the new economy which we are entering into is a different economy altogether. I don't think that the new economy would be urban-centric economy. And the government should take notice, multilateral agencies should take notice, because we just can't keep pumping in more money in the name of priming the economy onto urban infrastructure. Today, as you know, some of the leading companies in the technology sector, and including my company, we have allowed people to work from anywhere. They don't have to get back to city. They don't have to get back to their offices. What does it mean? People would be connecting themselves to their servers from anywhere in the world, and this is how the distribution of the new economy will happen. This means we don't need large cities anymore, and we have to understand this and create a new economy, and we have to encourage that new economy, which is much more rural centric. And this is where opportunities lie. Although there would be requirement of new construction activity and the sand in these areas, new areas, it may not be like what it used to be in the city infrastructure. The urban infrastructure shouldn't be encouraged going forward, and we have to create hinterland infrastructure, which is much more green infrastructure. And coming to recycling, I am not an expert to talk about, but I can certainly talk about, there are so many ways in which we can reduce the usage of the sand in the construction activity. If you go back to history, if you see our own buildings, particularly in the in the countries like India, we never used to use this much of the cement concrete in our olden buildings. If you go back to the our heritage buildings, the usage of sand is much limited. Particularly the externals of the walls, we don't use sand at all. It's very, very beautiful. We can create an exposed, the kind of buildings wherein the stone is exposed, and we can use much lesser sand for the plastering from the external side of the building. So I think the whole concept of living spaces going forward would be different. And if you wake up to the fact that the new economy's dimensions are different, I think the whole opportunity is opening up for a new world. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting view. Actually, I met an architect who was saying the same, that the best way to improve the life in the cities was to improve the rural area, so that people are not migrating anymore. So like bringing like optic fibers and internet for aiding economy. Well, Charles, what do you think about that? Do you see this trend also? Is it studied in terms of development?
Without doubt, I think it's pushing us to use technologies in a way that I think, as Pratap was giving a very good example of the changes that are coming that no one could have seen a year ago. And the one issue that is interesting to look at in this is the data privacy aspect of it, because what we're using now are technologies like drones, for example, that are a terrific technological tool to look at how construction is taking place. But many governments are quite sensitive about the use of some of these technologies. These technologies are being used for tracing supply. Again, how much information is appropriate, and when do you get into an area where you may be going too far or sharing too much? These are some of the challenges that I think we're facing. And then there's also, in this whole field, I mean, some of the questions were being raised about where is this large infrastructure going? Well, one element that I think the UNEP report points out, where this issue of technology is interesting, is the Belt and Road Initiative, where you look at probably the largest sense of one initiative for infrastructure in the world. It's not clear from where I sit, what are the standards that are proposed to be applied in those 70 countries that may be engaged in the BRI? If we're working with multilateral development banks, then there are transparent, accountable, clear, harmonized set of standards, all of which require you to take into account ecosystem impact. Will that be the case for the BRI? Now, I think these are interesting things for us to explore. And technology lets us see things in a way that we never did before. Our projects now use GIS data, satellite data, to see what's going on in the ground. The project in Jamaica that Anthony was talking about, we have satellite images to see where the road was originally proposed, where the road has been now proposed, what its proximity is to some of these deposits. So the technology is a fantastic tool, but governments and individual citizens are a little concerned about, are you going too far? Are you interfering? Are there national security issues that we have to think about when we're looking at this kind of landscape approach? So it's fascinating, and the legal framework and policy framework is really going to evolve as we get into this particular issue.
Thank you. That is really music to my ear, as I'm leading an office that deals with remote sensing and GIS. So this is definitely, we're happy to be part of that solution. Lisa, there's a question maybe for you. Is infrastructure an investment priority for government in the COVID recovery, and how is SAN being factored in?
So I do think infrastructure is part of the investments taking place. SAN clearly plays a role in it. On the other hand, I think we should also look at other opportunities to do climate action. So it does not always have to be an infrastructural solution. So I think by choosing the way how we do things, the measures we take, also just referring to the digital solutions we were just talking about. If you have risk mapping properly done, if you have monitoring, forecasting systems, automated alerting, you can also, that's also a whole chain of measures you can take instead of physical infrastructure. So I think infrastructure plays a role in the investments, but it should definitely not be the only way. We should look at alternatives.
Thank you. I had a question for Anthony here from the audience. What are the rules? Like you're talking that you can take sand from underwater, and people are taking sand from inland, from different places. What are the rules in Jamaica for and how do you regulate the extractions of sand?
Right. So, thank you, Pascal. Right. There are regulatory guidelines, and in fact, legislation relating to mining and quarrying of sand in the inland area, primarily, of course, river basins. And then, of course, there are other pieces of legislation that deal with the removal of sediments and sand from our marine and coastal areas. There is presently strict management with respect to how we remove sand from our sand dunes. So there has to be some specific permitting for sand removal from sand dunes. But there are a suite of licenses for extraction within riverbeds, sand from terragenous sources. I think one little point I'd like to make is the question of the calcareous type of sand on some of our beaches. Based on carbon dating, a lot of the sand are considered to be relatively old. So it means that our sand-producing organisms in the coastal environment perhaps are not producing the sand at the rate that we'd want to. And this is an area that we need to look at going forward. One area that we've been looking at is the question of crushing limestone. A lot of our bedrock is limestone, so it's crushing limestone to make sand and aggregate as a alternative to naturally generated sand. Thank you.
Thank you. That's for Jamaica. If we extrapolate that to the global level, I mean, how and who should regulate the use of sand? And maybe that's a question for Charles. In a sustainable manner at the global level. I mean, of course, we tried at UNEP, we tried to push that at the governments. It was probably the first time that this question of sand resource management was provided in the desk of the member states. But Charles, do you see a regulation mechanisms at the global level? Who would be the main partner for that?
Well, I mean, it to me, in theory, it's there, because if you look at various regional seas agreements, you look at the principles that you have in the Convention on Biological Diversity or the climate change regime, which clearly recognizes the global commitment to adaptation and resilience. You have the multilateral framework that can support national governments deepening their legal framework on those particular issues. We have, for example, in our environmental and social framework, which you know, all of our 189 member governments have agreed to, that if we're doing project finance, we're required to look at the impacts on soil formation. So very clearly, you can encompass impact on sand extraction within that approach. And I think the other multilateral development banks do the same thing. It's so difficult to get multilateral agreements adopted and so difficult for them to be enforceable that I would think the kind of work that UNEP is doing, helping governments enhance their own legal framework to fit those principles that you have at the multilateral level, is probably the way to go. Draw attention to the issue, and then it can, you know, very often these are guidelines that then transmit into national legal requirements and further down, because remember, many of these issues are not necessarily resolved by national legislation, but it may be provincial, where I think, as Pratap has mentioned, very often you want municipal zoning, municipal regulations. These are, again, these are principles that have to cascade to the site themselves. And that's where technical assistance and development organizations should be helping, because they're complex. As the UNEP paper points out, we have many different types of extraction, many different types of aggregates, and so there's no one size fits all for this. I guess is really what I should be saying in order to regulate.
That's very interesting, because Pratap, you've been actually bringing that from the local level to Bangalore and then to the entire province. Tell us a bit more about this example. How do you generate that governance from basically from local to province level?
Thank you. I would call it as a glocal approach. It is not just local alone. It's a combination of local and global. At a policy level, of course, the sensitization has to happen at a provincial government level or a judiciary level, but the actual action has to happen at the ground level. That is local. And in the local, what is important for the success of such project is the participation of everybody. Unless you take the confidence, take the stakeholders into confidence, any such initiative of digitalizing the end-to-end operation of sand would completely fail. See, we shouldn't be threatening the livelihoods of the people involved. And actually, if you closely see, particularly in the Indian context, there are all these small, local communities who are involved in sand mining and transportation operations. And actually, when you talk about sustainability to them, they understand it. And when they would like to have that sand as a resource for a longer period, they would respond to the need of such a participation. You need to take the local stakeholders, including the local administration, into confidence. And when we demonstrate them by digitalizing, by bringing the whole thing into a transparency, you will be able to regulate better, you will be able to sustain better. That is where the change happens. We have been very successful in ensuring that sand is not transported from a district level, from a small unit of the administration in a country like India. It's a district. In the district level, sand is consumed within the district and they are not transported to the big cities. That itself has helped a lot in containing the resource within that local area. And that is where the sustainability comes in. And end-to-end transparency certainly helps everybody to measure it, to see it, so that, and also to contain the over exploitation of the resource. The key, in my opinion, is in creating an inclusive model, and of course, the application of digital technology which are available today. And then ordinary people, who are just taking the boats and going to a river, center of the river, and bring the sand. That is their livelihood. If you fix a small GPS And Pascal will be very happy because whenever I talk about GIS and GPS, that is your core area of interest. In a map you will be able to see, and we are using the satellite technologies to identify the areas within the this river where they can remove this sand, and you put those geofencing, and when the boat goes there and takes the sand and comes back, everything gets transparent and everything gets disciplined. And these small people, these small communities, they are responsible. Somebody has to teach them, somebody has to involve them, and not to threaten them. If you threaten their livelihood, it becomes ugly. When they understand that it is for their good, I have seen these people participating in the change process much more willingly. And the entire model could be self-sustaining. You don't need to bring in huge investments to do this. A small contribution from each one of them makes the whole system sustainable. The entire system which we are able to give to the administration free of cost. We are not charging anybody. And it's a small subscription fee which these transporters and these local consumers who use a smartphone to book sand, just like they're booking Uber cab, that is the whole change process thanks to the technology. Hope I've answered your question, Pascal.
Yeah, no, fantastic. I was very impressed by what you were able to do in your province, and I think technology has definitely a role to play here. So we're coming to nearly closing to that part, but just one more question for Lisette, maybe in procurement. How can you assess the value of a grey option versus natural option on delivering the same service? Because I think that makes sense for the decision makers. They will look at price as well. So how do you make this kind of assessment?
So what I think is important is to look at life cycle costs, so that you not only take a look at the investment cost at the start of a measure, but take into account the full life cycle cost. So also taking operational cost into account with pricing if you compare grey and green infrastructure. Another element that needs to be taken into account is the local impact. So items that have been discussed indeed, there is the environmental impact, the social impact. So I think there's whole systems of analysis for comparing different kind of solutions, both on benefits as well as negative impact. So I think it should be often it's a kind of multi-criteria analysis, balancing out the different options. But the key for me is not to look at one moment, but really look at a longer term perspective and taking into account the full impact of measures, not only zoom into one element, but take the integrated approach.
Thank you, Lisette. We have one more minute, so last question for Anthony. We have sea level rise, we have those coastal infrastructure. This is very key, especially for an island state, if these coastal infrastructure are affected by coastal erosion, storm surge, and so on. What is this integrated approach in the management of sand? How can we use that, or this? Yeah, so what Lisette was referring to with this green engineering, is it something that in Jamaica you're looking at, this management of sand for coastal infrastructure and for green engineering?
Yes, Pascal. I think we'd like to think that we've taken an integrated approach to the response to coastal erosion, beach erosion. The situation in Jamaica is perhaps a little bit unique in a sense, because while one would expect the government to lead in a lot of instances in supporting coastal protection works, whether it's hard engineering or a hybrid or green type of investment, a lot of the developments along the coast are done by the private sector, and what we try to do is to support with information, with guidelines, through the legislative and regulatory licensing regime to incentivize a move towards nature-based, ecosystem-based types of solutions. So there's beach nourishment in instances. We have a lot of work now in our protected areas and sanctuaries for coral reef enhancement, building of coral nurseries, and so on. So that's the type of, I suppose, investment that we're promoting and, I suppose, incentivizing at this point.
Thank you, Anthony. So last thing, because this is the last round, we've been learning a lot of things today. We learned about the economic crisis and how it might be reignited by government injecting in infrastructure. We've been learning about gray versus green engineering. We've been learning about technology. So this is your takeaway for the participants. Please post the main message you are taking away from this webinar in the chat box. It'll be interesting to see what you took out of this discussion. And this is the last round. I want to give an opportunity for the final and closing comments for each of our panelists. So in 2 minutes, really, each of you bring your last word, what you want to, as a takeaway message for our audience today. Starting with Charles.
Well, thank you, Pascal. I think the first message is it's interesting that we work on environmental and social impact for decades, and this is probably the first time I think maybe any of us have participated in a seminar on the impacts of sand. And when one looks at the Apple podcast and you realize that it's air, water, and sand are the three major elements that that we have to deal with, it's pretty fascinating in and of itself that here we are. But second, that the concept, I think we've all used this notion of integration, that all of these risks that we're looking at are ones that we have to look at both from a global standpoint and from a micro standpoint, because whether it's the impact on a local fishing village of the beach being washed away, or whether it's greenhouse gases from cement, it's all connected together. And so the environmental and social due diligence and practice that we have embraced as a society just now needs to encompass this other element. And I think this kind of discussion enables us to do that. We're now looking at bringing in technology to do it in a way that we haven't before. And this fascinating opportunity to move from gray to green is something that I think really we should embrace full-heartedly. And I'm pleased to see that we in the multilateral development bank world are moving in that direction. And we hope that that will also encourage large-scale private actors and national funds to also join us in that direction. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Charles. And indeed, I gave a presentation in London at the Royal Geological Society, which exists for almost 200 years, and they told me it was the first time they held a conference on sand. So your point is absolutely true. Lisette, your final closing comment, please.
So the first one would be dealing with sand and aggregate challenges. It's really inevitable to discuss when we talk about rebuilding better. Like said before, it's about sustainable solutions for sand and aggregate challenges, and that requires an integrated system approach fitting local context, and by doing so adding to a global contribution, social inclusiveness and empowering people, transparent governance and regulation, and public-private partnerships. I really believe we need to do it together, and it should not be one or the other. We can do this rebuilding better by a mix of measures. So we can prevent the increase of sand demand by applying alternative resilience measures like the nature-based solutions like sandscaping, but also technologies and digital solutions. And last but not least, I would like to say we really should grasp the opportunity of the current investments in response to COVID-19 as an accelerator for climate action, enhancing resilience and rebuilding better. There's a great opportunity to do it now, we need to do it together, and we all have a role to play. So I'm very pleased with these kind of discussions as an accelerating driver to bring this further.
Right, let's be much more clever on the way we're using this very precious material. Pratap, please, your final comments.
While it is a reality that COVID-19 has decimated the global economy, the opportunity it is bringing is something phenomenal and unprecedented. It's a great opportunity for all of us to rebuild a new world. And this rebuilding the new world and a new economy perhaps can start from sand. What you are seeing on the screen is a 200 times magnification of the sand. Because most of us have not even seen the sand in its real avatar. Look at the beauty of this, humble material. And when you see it with a magnifying lens, this is what you see. So beautiful it is, so kind the nature is. But if you take steps like what we have talking about, if you take steps to create a sustainability in sand, we are going to create sustainability for an economy, because there is a lesson in this for every dimension of the economy. And I'm so pleased to participate in this discussion. And thank you so much for the organizers.
Thank you very much, Pratap. It was a privilege to have you on board. Anthony, please, your final words on this one. Oh, for the time being, of course.
Thank you very much, Pascal. I think as we look to be aggressive in terms of our economies and building back from COVID, I think I'd like to make 3 points of message. I think on the question of our sand resources, we need to look at it as part of a ecosystem, and in fact a sensitive ecosystem, and I think it has applicability specific to countries like Jamaica. That approach needs to be taken in terms of its management. The nature-based, ecosystem-based solutions are going to be key in my mind. Looking at how we manage our watersheds so that the sand that's generated from there is sustainable. How we look after our sensitive coastal resources, as I indicated before, or seagrass beds or reefs. It's important that the ecology of sand is accounted for. Another issue and message, I think, is a question of community livelihoods. They depend a lot on the resources of our coast, including our sand and beach resources. What are the measures for supporting alternative solutions, and how these communities can play a part in that? And then tied to that, another message relates to the question of equity and equitable access to the resources is, I think, fundamental for us here in Jamaica. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's a word of wisdom, certainly, the question of equity. And this is really fundamental, that this resource is not yet being taken as such a strategic material, but if your entire society is depending on sand, it must be a strategic material. And we should not think of sand as not just common material, like Pratap through those beautiful grain of sand, but it's also this value that we have for the society that is not well enough understood. So I would like to thank our panelists today for bringing this discussion. So really thank you, Lisette, Pratap, Anthony, and Charles, for your extremely useful insights on this question of sand and how to build back better in the concept of this post-COVID crisis. I hope everybody stays safe. I want to thank all the audience for attending this webinar. Thank you to Ben Simons and his team at GGKP for making the webinar possible. I would like to also to thank the government of Switzerland for their generous support and passion for this topic. We've been really supported both diplomatically but also financially by Switzerland for doing our global sand observatory initiative. A few things that are coming next. So this was the first public event in intensive 6 months of work ahead. So where should people follow our work, including material for this discussion? You can follow work on these links that appears on your screen. So you have our website, unepgrid.ch/sand. You can communicate with us at this email, sand@unepgrid.ch. You can follow up on Green Growth Knowledge Initiative and the Knowledge Partnership at this link, and you will find the podcast as well. You can follow us on Twitter, GRID-GVA, GRID-GVA. And do not forget to register to our next GGKP webinar on sand. It will be on 19 January 2021. The registration is already open, so you can press on this link. And we will discuss the next one will be on international cooperation and solutions as we moved into the United Nations Environment Assembly 5th session. It's a very important time because we saw that UNIA 4 was the very first time that the government took position with a resolution on mineral resource governance and also on sustainable infrastructure. So now we will come with follow-up information to bring this news, bring this expertise to the governments so that they got answers on how we can move into a more sustainable approach with sand and infrastructure. Definitely, the 2020 years has been exceptional in many ways and tragic with many people dying, but also extremely great opportunities with people rediscovering the role of nature for their well-being. So I think this is the discussion that is now need to have. So we will continue to do our research with the Global Sand Observatory to bring figures, to bring solutions, and trying to bring experts at the table, which will be the next one on 19 January. So looking forward to see you next, all of you and more. And thank you again for everybody for participating to this webinar. Bye-bye.